It's so hard to be a Christian in the world today, isn't it? It's like faith isn't even important in the world anymore. And if we do try to bring faith into things, then there's a sort of cancel culture that prevents us talking about Jesus. And there's so much pressure from materialism and personal ambition. It's like we're all striving to be successful. We've got to have the right jobs. We've got to chase the likes on social media. We've got to be wearing the right clothes and be friends with the right people. And then we look at what's going on in the world around us, the wars, the gap between rich and poor, financial crises, the division in our nations. And we wonder, where is God in all of this? And then we're expected to have a Christian response to all sorts of social issues like gender and sexuality, the rise of AI, climate change, and immigration. It's like from every angle, it's really tough to be a Christian in the world today. So how do we navigate all that and live out our faith amongst our family and our friends and in the local community of which we're a part? Where in the Bible can we get some teaching and some good examples of how to live out that life? Well, for me, I find the Old Testament prophets really helpful. And I want to give you 3 principles that they spoke out for to help people live out their faith in the world. And they're really good principles for us still today as Christians. Firstly, we need to be the voice of conscience in the world. It's not easy to stand up for what is right. It's not easy to speak out for what we believe is God's truth. But part of what it means to be a Christian today is to do exactly that. We are living in a time when our society are losing their way. The rich are getting richer. The poor are getting poorer. There's racism, intolerance. Those who are weak are becoming increasingly marginalized, and it's the powerful elite, many politicians and big corporations, feather their own nests at the expense of others. And the Old Testament prophets knew all about that because that was exactly what was happening in Israel and Judah during their time. The Old Testament prophets were like the moral compass of their times. They stood fearlessly against the way society was going, challenging social injustice and moral decay, reminding us that a just society cannot be built on the foundations of oppression. In Amos 5:15, the prophet says, "Hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts." In Isaiah 1:17, we read this, "Seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow." Micah 6:8 says, "This is what God requires of you, to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God." These are timeless values on which our societies need to be built. And as Christians, it's up to us to speak out for these truths and be the moral compass for our local communities. It's not easy. We need to have courage because we might get mocked or ignored or cancelled. We might lose friends, but we know what the values of God's kingdom are, and we need to speak out those truths no matter what cost there is to ourselves. Secondly, we need to live differently. Jesus said in Matthew 6:19-20, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." What's your greatest treasure? Things you own or your relationship with God? I'm going through a really interesting process at the moment of giving away all my books and lots of other things I own to people who I think can use them better than me. And with the books, it's really fascinating for me. I've got way over 1,000 books and I've distributed something like 600 or so in the last year, but there's a few that I'm really clinging on to that I just can't imagine being without. And the whole process is teaching me a lot about myself, what I value and why, and how I need to stop being attached to material possessions. And I've got a long way to go with God in this, believe me. But as Christians, we need to live differently and try to find our treasure in God and not in our possessions and instant gratification, because our possessions become idols for us. We cling to them instead of clinging to God. The Old Testament prophets remind us to critically examine our priorities so that our pursuit of material things doesn't eclipse our devotion to God. In Jeremiah 2:13, God says this, "My people have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." You see, if we want to drink from the living water that gives us ultimate joy and peace, we need to prioritize and treasure our relationship with God. But too often we dig our own cisterns and look for water elsewhere. Our possessions, our popularity, our jobs, our ambitions, our relationships. But all of these things are only temporary and they cannot quench our eternal thirst. How do we live as Christians in the world today? As Christians, we need to live differently by reconnecting with our spiritual values and prioritizing our treasure in heaven over our treasure on earth. Everything about how the world is today tries to persuade us to go in the other direction and find our sense of self-worth and identity in possessions and popularity and personal ambition. But to live the Christian life, we need to know where our treasure lies and pursue only that. Thirdly, we need to give hope to others. So as a Christian, you know what it is to have hope. You experience the love of God for yourself. You know what it is to be saved through the cross of Christ, and you have the hope of eternal life with God. But most people don't have that hope. In fact, we are surrounded by people who feel utterly hopeless, guilt about their past, depressed, lonely and empty in their present, anxious and fearful for the future. That is the common condition for so many people, but you can speak hope into their lives. In fact, not only can you speak hope into their lives, you are actually commanded by Jesus to do so. In Matthew 28:19, Jesus says, "Go and make disciples of all nations." And making disciples is all about introducing people to the hope they have in God and the promise of life in all its fullness. And that's what the Old Testament prophets did. Yes, they gave warnings. Yes, they challenged people. But they also spoke hope into their lives about how if they turned to God, they would be restored and transformed. Isaiah 40:31. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. Joel 2:25. I will repay you for the years the locusts have eaten. Ezekiel 36:26. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. Zephaniah 3:17. In his love, God will no longer rebuke you, but will rejoice over you with singing. There are so many passages of hope in the prophets, and as you live out your Christian life in the world today, you are called to speak hope into the lives of others so that they will come into a relationship with God as well. It's not easy being a Christian in the world today. There are so many pressures on us to give up the faith, or if we want to follow Jesus, to do it privately and not share that faith with others. But that's not our calling as Christians. Our calling is to be bold and courageous and to share the good news of Jesus with others wherever we have the opportunity to do so. The Old Testament prophets model for us 3 ways of living out the faith in our world today. By being the voice of conscience in your local community, challenging injustice and advocating for the marginalized. By openly living differently, valuing your treasures in heaven and not prioritizing your treasures here on earth. By speaking hope to others, introducing them to the riches of God's grace so that they may know what it is to have life in all its fullness. Will you follow the example of the Old Testament prophets and live publicly for God?